Hi, this is Says Zavalin.
And I'm Max Newbold.
We are Second Life correspondents for Smart History.
And here we are once again in the recreation of the Sistine Chapel
on Vassar's campus.
And we're going to talk this time not about the ceiling, but about the fresco that Michelangelo painted on the wall behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel about 25 years later.
After the ceiling.
After the ceiling.
The Last Judgment.
The Last Judgment, and from 1534 to 1541. So this one took about 7 years.
Now, this was actually a commission that came from not Julius II.
No, who's dead.
Right, but from two popes, actually. It was Clement VII who had sort of arranged for the back wall to be painted, the wall, which is really critical because it's directly in back of and above the altar, the high altar, where the Pope himself stands.
That's right.
and addresses the cardinals. I mean, there is no more sacred a space, really.
Yes. It was Paul III who did the final commission.
Who comes right after Clement VII. That's right.
This is a very, very old subject. It's one of the oldest subjects. Yeah. It's the Last Judgment. It's when Christ returns to the earth, the time of the second coming, and judges all of mankind and separates on his left those who have sinned, who will go to hell, and those on his right, the blessed, who will go to heaven. So we need to think about this in terms of Christ's left and Christ's right as he separates the blessed from the damned.
So this subject is probably the single most terrifying subject that one could expect to see in the Catholic tradition. And in fact, interestingly, it is often a subject that is painted or carved directly over the exit of a church, so that when you leave, sometimes an entrance, but very often over an exit, so that when you leave the church, it's the last thing you see before you go back into the world. Because, of course, everybody is full of good intentions in church, but walking back into the real world, one needs a good dose of fear, and this would really provide
Sin
that.
And you will burn in hell. That is basically the message of the Last Judgment.
But you said a moment ago that it's important to understand this painting within the context of the historical, the political context of the day. This is being painted again in 1534, 1541, and Europe is in turmoil at this moment.
Yes.
And the Catholic Church itself is threatened to its core.
It is. About 20 years before this was painted, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a door of a church. And
in northern Germany.
In northern Germany, quite far away. But
Luther was a Catholic priest.
Yes.
But he was forcing a kind of reform.
Within the church, yes. And pointing to very specific practices within the Catholic Church that he believed were corrupt.
Interestingly, and ironically perhaps, practices that helped finance Julius II and Michelangelo's earlier commissions.
And the rebuilding of the Church of St. Peter's.
That's right. But that's another story.
Yes. So the church is in turmoil. Really, the period that we've been describing as the High Renaissance, this embrace of the human body, of the classical antiquity, that period is really over. The church is under attack. And it's important to see this fresco in the context of an embattled church.
This is a painting that is full of a kind of anger and fear. And I think you're right. I think this notion of a kind of context that is absolutely threatening will make sense, because gone is so much of the optimism and so much of the beauty,
the ideal beauty
that Michelangelo renders on the ceiling.
Yes.
And instead you have a kind of absolute aggression. Look at Christ himself in the center.
Yes.
Here we have Christ who is not paying attention to the blessed. His attention is focused on the damned.
To his left, yes.
That's right. And his hand is raised. You can actually see the stick. You can see the holes which he received on the cross. But he's about to smite the damned into hell.
And it looks as though with his left hand he's pointing to his own wounds that he received on the cross, as though he's saying, I suffered. Now those who have sinned will suffer
as well.
Right.
It's almost Mary who's under his arm, who is actually attending in this painting to the blessed.
But cowering beneath him, as though she can no longer help anyone.
And
she can no longer intercede for mankind.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Now, Michelangelo is still Michelangelo, and he's still rendering Christ with a kind of massiveness that is an expression of his divinity.
Yes.
Almost over the top here, almost mannerist, actually.
It's true.
And it's almost like Marvel Comics in a sense. I mean, look, it's muscle upon muscle in that torso.
He strides forward. Now, on either side of Christ are saints and other, important Old Testament figures.
And this is traditional. And in fact, when we say left and right,
we mean lower left
that's
and
right.
lower right.
It really doesn't. This is heaven
Right.
when we're at this level.
Right.
And so the left right don't really
Right.
accord.
And so some of the figures that we see there, besides Mary, Christ crouching under Christ's arm, we see St. Lawrence, for example, holding the grill that he was
We see St.
burned
Peter,
on.
who's
Peter
looking
with
furious.
keys.
He's got this key. And this is just slightly to the bottom right of Christ, to his left. We see a large figure of St. Bartholomew, one of the most grotesque images rendered in this painting.
Yes, St. Bartholomew, as many early saints was
martyred
in a really hideous way. And Bartholomew was flayed. He was skinned alive.
And he's actually holding his own skin
in his left hand,
as he holds the knife in his right.
Right.
And looks up to Christ.
Right, so he holds, as most saints do generally, the instruments of his martyrdom.
But it's so graphically rendered.
Yes.
To hold his own skin, which just hangs down, is
Yeah.
extraordinary. And of course, there is a theory
In the skin of St. Bartholomew.
that the face that is rendered in the skin is actually a self-portrait of the artist.
I think it's not, I guess it's a theory, but it's I think it's something we're pretty sure about, because that really looks like Michelangelo. I mean, we know what Michelangelo looked like. We know that Michelangelo had a kind of deformed bridge of his nose.
That curly brown hair.
It looks exactly like Michelangelo there.
And it's an extraordinary idea to begin to contemplate what Michelangelo would have meant
Yes.
to render himself in this lifeless skin.
And in the place where he's put himself. And let's come back to that.
Okay.
So let's talk for a minute about the figures in the Last Judgment, because we've talked about how that ideal beauty is gone. And here Michelangelo's really, it seems to me, moving away from that idea of beauty as a connection to the divine and as a way to get to the divine, is instead portraying figures who are sometimes quite ugly.
Ugly, and also their limbs are no longer graceful,
No.
but akimbo. It seems this painting is full of activity, but it seems as if so often there's a kind of almost violence or almost a kind of chaos in the way in which the figures link together and the movements of the limbs between them.
And their bodies are sometimes, a little bit almost deformed. Their heads are too small. They don't have those lovely harmonious proportions like the figures on the ceiling. And it's almost as though it's always seemed to me that Michelangelo is saying, this is not a celebration of human beings anymore. This is a work of art.
Or of human beings' relationship to God. To God, that's right.
This is a painting where the message is primary. And he's going to do what he has to do to the figures, to the composition, to make sure that message, which is sin and you will burn in hell, leave the church, betray the church, and you will burn in hell for eternity.
So this is an extraordinarily modern idea. It will take hundreds of more years for artists to be comfortable with the idea of deforming the body in order to express a more total message.
Yes.
This is a very modern idea.
Yes,
in that
and
sense.
I think it's perfectly seen in the figure of St. Catherine, who is holding a wheel, who bends forward. Her head is too small. Her arms are kind of grotesque. The position of her body is so awkward. There's just nothing beautiful and graceful about her, and we can say that about so many of the figures here. And one other thing that I like to talk about with the figures of the saints who surround Christ, Michelangelo, when he was painting these figures, he said, wanted to show these saints to sow the seeds of faith. And I think that showing these figures who died these really terribly painful deaths, St. Lawrence, St. Sebastian, who died by being pierced with arrows, St. Catherine, who died on a wheel, these men and women who gave their lives and suffered so simply for their faith in Christ. That this idea that one can believe, one can, through anything, through all of these tests, one's faith in Christ can persevere.
One wonders then,
even in the face of death and suffering.
And one wonders if that was a question that Michelangelo himself, in his older age, is beginning to ask of himself.
Yes,
and
I think
course,
it's a question for this moment in time.
It is, given the war, the suffering, the violence that is surrounding the church at this time.
Right.
Let's take a look at some of the figures that are a little bit lower down and that really speak to the narrative of the Last Judgment itself. In some ways, we have to begin really with the group of figures immediately below Christ, Christ.
The angels?
The angels blowing their golden trumpets as loudly as possible, almost looking like with their cheeks bulging out.
To awaken the dead from their graves.
That's right. And if we look a little bit to the lower left of those trumpeting angels, we can actually see Michelangelo's...
Christ's right.
Christ, right? We can see in those green hills, we can actually see the dead being resurrected. These spirits, these skeletons that are musty and rising from the dead. It's a fabulous, almost literal rendering.
And then as they move up, angels reach down. These wingless, seemingly male angels reach and grab them as they float up.
Look at the group
and
that are being pulled
them
up by the rosary.
Heaven. Right,
That's
as though Michelangelo is saying by prayer. By the strength of prayer, one can get to heaven.
It's Michelangelo, so it's tangible and physical.
Yes.
And it seems as if that angel has to be enormously physically powerful to actually defy gravity and pull them up. There's strain and effort here.
Yep. And then on the other side, Christ's left or our right, we have the figures who are damned to hell.
And instead of the angels pulling them up, we now have the angels with their fists
beating them
down.
And these figures who are trying to claw their way up, who angels force back down.
Even as the devils below begin to claw at them and to pull them down.
I know,
into
it's
hell.
fabulous.
So being pushed and pulled, but probably the most memorable figure among this group is that damned man.
The one who's just realized which way he's going.
The sense of human torment, the pathos in that face is extraordinary.
Yeah.
There is there not only sadness and fear, but recognition of his own failings.
And to me, the sort of symbol of the human condition. That no matter how good we try to be, no matter how good our intentions, no matter how much we can see what is right, we often do what is wrong. But at this moment of reckoning, on this day of Christ's second coming, we are judged and the decision is rendered.
And his expression so beautifully crystallizes that moment of recognition of all of that truth.
Yeah.
Once you get down to hell,
yeah.
Of course, you don't go directly to hell. You have to be ferried there. And Michelangelo...
In a kind of classical mythology.
That's right. And which is reiterated, in a sense, made permanent by Dante's Inferno. We have Charon, the ferryman, who is beating the souls off of his boat to the shores of hell, because, of course, they're incredibly reluctant to go. But they're also assisted by devils whose pitchforks are harvesting those souls and bringing them down.
And pulling them in.
But perhaps my favorite...
The far right bottom.
That's right. My favorite element in the painting is the story just down at the bottom where we see Minos, who has a great serpent wrapped around his waist. Vasari tells a great story about this little vignette. According to Vasari, Michelangelo wanted very much for the Pope not to bring visitors in as he painted. But on one day, the Pope brought Biagio da Siena, a very high-minded man, who Vasari calls a master of ceremonies, in to see Michelangelo's nearly completed painting. And the Pope asked Biagio, "What do you think?" Well, he said quite directly and in front of the artist, "This is totally inappropriate for the chapel of the Pope.
Too many nudes.
Too many nudes. Mm-hmm. This is appropriate for a tavern, not for the Vatican."
Michelangelo didn't like that.
But Michelangelo had his revenge. And as soon as Biagio da Siena left with the Pope, Michelangelo painted his face from memory on
the face of the satanic figure down in the lower right.
Yes, who is being devoured by a serpent.
Yes. He got his revenge.
He certainly did. Michelangelo often got his way.
He did. So now let's go back to where Michelangelo chose to put his self-portrait. Because I think that it's interesting. He's sort of, he's in that area on that same level as Christ. So he's with the saints and other important figures, but he's sort of hovering dangerously over this lower
It's not just that he's
left
hovering.
area.
It's not that he's just hovering dangerously. It's that Bartholomew himself doesn't seem to be paying much attention to the skin, and he holds it rather nonchalantly, as if he might just
drop it,
let go.
Yes.
And if he let go, that skin would fall directly into the boat
Right.
of Sharon and
Right.
would be transported to hell.
And it also looks to me like he's sort of midway. That skin is sort of midway between the saving power of Christ and the figure, the figure we refer to as the damned man, who has just realized that he's going to hell. Clearly indicating Michelangelo's own uncertainty, which we also know from his poetry during this period, the uncertainty of the fate of his own soul. Whether he would, when he died, because he's an old man by now, although he would live much longer, go to heaven when he died or go to hell. And obviously Michelangelo's great fears that he would go to hell. And Michelangelo, I think, even at this time looking up at the ceiling that he had painted 25 years earlier and wondering if that early work that celebrated human beings and the human body and was not so obviously in the service of the church would somehow
damn him,
or,
or
not be helpful on that day of judgment.
It makes sense to me, and I think it's actually that argument is strengthened by the fact that Michelangelo chose to render himself as an empty shell, as a skin, because you use the term soul. What direction? Michelangelo's soul. There is no space for soul here.
That's
in a
true.
sense, could this be a kind of indictment, as you spoke of, that he has spent his life creating fictions,
That's right.
that he has spent his life
empty.
Creating, in a sense, the outermost skin,
Right.
likeness, but
Celebrating.
without substance, right? Because here we have no interior, no soul, no substance. Is that what he's done? When we saw him breathe life into stone,
Right.
was that real life? No, not as God creates life.
Right.
But
And yet there's a kind of pride.
a falseness, a false pride,
Right.
yes. And it must have been...
Michelangelo is the creator.
It must...
And his nickname, of course, is Il Divino, the divine one.
And so is this Michelangelo in his later life beginning to rue, in a sense, his braggadocio,
Right.
To rue his
pride in his own creations.
These were the very questions that the church itself were beginning to ask.
That's
the
right.
Reformation, I think, caused a tremendous questioning. And we see it here in the microcosm of one man's life, but I think it was a set of questions that the church as a whole was beginning to grapple with.
How does one get to heaven? Is the church, the only one way to get to heaven? Are the sacraments, do they do what they said they would do?
Is the pomp and ceremony of the church essential, or
right.
is it in some way a bar?
Right, or is it about a more personal relationship with God? Is it about prayer?
These are all questions that I think absolutely inform this painting, and thus make this painting an expression of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation that will develop.
This moment of religious questioning and turmoil.
This is a painting that is all about turmoil.
Yes.